Hi, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Madness and Meaning. I think this will be a really interesting exploration of something that recently came to my awareness. And this is the topic of fearing fear, which kind of came to me in lieu of this home community that I've created, where I really wanted to create a space where me, as well as anyone who wants to join me inside of that community, has an opportunity to witness ourselves inside of who we are and decide to shift that experience for a different one if we feel called to. And what this really is a way of experiencing your own sense of self, exploring your own thoughts and belief systems about who you are, and having the power to change it in any way you desire to. And from that new place, go out into the world and experience things and create things from a completely different energy. And so it's all about meeting you where you are and realizing that you have the power to recreate your entire reality. And the way to do that requires being with a lot of discomfort. And I speak about discomfort a lot inside of the community, about how there's resistance around discomfort, around the different ways to be with our discomfort, how to hold it safely, how to hold it with compassion. And I've tried really hard to provide very gentle experiences of what this could look like to allow for um, a gradual exposure to some very deep and sensitive and vulnerable experiences that are going to be held inside of that space. And I have been witnessing, surprisingly, a lot more fear than I anticipated. And this is normal. I expected this. I have been doing this for a few years now. I've witnessed myself inside of transformation and I've coached other people as well. But this is my first community experience. And I've been witnessing not only the amount of fear that there really is inside of being met with our own unworthiness, our own shame, our own judgment, but the fear, the fear of what it's going to be like, the fear of what it's going to feel like. And it's like layers of fear on top of each other.
Mm-hmm.
And this was a little bit surprising to me. I guess I just didn't anticipate that in the way that I have been witnessing it. And I thought that that would be a really interesting conversation to have around not only the awareness of what we're afraid of, but the fear of our own fear in all of these different aspects. Why we fear our own fear, the role that fear plays, and what's really required to move through this experience and slowly peel back the layers of fear so that they don't feel as threatening as they do now.
As I was imagining this conversation, I started to hear different aspects and talking points that we could go through. And one that came very automatically was talking around this idea that, you know, if we recognize that there is going to be pain or discomfort or fear in the process of moving us towards what we want, then we have two options really. We can either, face the fear or we can turn away from it and avoid. And as that dialogue started to progress, I started to just feel like, oh, I feel like I'm listening to I don't know, any old masculine man's brotherhood podcast of some sort about come on, bro. You can't let fear hold you back and you gotta push through the discomfort, and that's what alpha males do. And I was like, wait, okay, how can we how can we talk about this idea in a way that is more authentic to us? Because this these concepts of when we're moving towards what we want, we're going to have to get uncomfortable. And on the other side of fear is usually the very thing that we want. Like, these are not new ideas. Like, we're all very familiar with these narratives around fear and getting uncomfortable, etc. And so I'm excited for us to navigate this conversation around, like, what do we do? What have we done? And what is our process for moving ourselves and supporting other people and moving through this period where they have very clearly identified that there's something that they want, there's some change that they want to experience or get or feel inside of their lives, but the thing that's slowing them down or holding them back is this massive fear, this fear of facing what that's going to mean for them or mean what that's going to mean about them, and just the inherent discomfort that comes with change. I want to be able to talk about it in a way that's not just a regurgitation of just feel the discomfort, bro, because if you don't, then you're a lazy piece of shit. Like, that's not necessarily our narrative.
Yeah, everything you want is on the other side of fear. And if you don't go for it,
Yes.
then you'll be left feeling like you never did.
Yes,
Yeah.
and exactly, and we've heard these things so many times, and so I think it would be really easy for someone to come into listening to this podcast episode and hear us queuing up the episode topic and thinking, "Oh, okay, here we go again. Someone else is going to tell me that in order to get what I want, I just got to get uncomfortable." Like, whoopie-doo, as if I
Yeah.
didn't already know that.
Yeah. What I would really like to explore to start is an understanding of what fear really is, what it is, where it comes from, our perspective and perception of ourselves inside of it, and then the physical experience of it, which is different from the mental and emotional one. And I think once we can tease that apart a little bit, then we can get a little deeper inside of what's required to move through it, what that process really looks like, and approaching it from a little bit of a different perspective than just man up and face your fear and get over it and feel the fear. And once you feel the fear, you can move past the, you know what I mean? Like, that's all dandy and fine, but it's harder to do than it is to talk about doing it. Um, and so I think let's just take this slow, have an exploration of where this goes. And I think approaching it from a gentler, more compassionate, more receptive place rather than this feeling of needing to make the experience of fear wrong, which I think is what leads into that conversation.
Yes. Yeah. And so I love this idea of actually looking more microscopically at what is this fear? What is this discomfort? What is this experience that we're having that we're labeling as fear and
Yeah.
discomfort? Like, what is really happening in these moments where we see that there's something that we want, something that's available to us, and we have reason for going through it, but we're stuck. We feel frozen. Like, what is that experience that we just so often slap the label on of that, like fear, or I'm scared, or that's uncomfortable? What's really going on there?
Well, if we were to start with that, if you were to explain what your perspective of fear really is, how would you describe that?
I think that we can break it down into the different ways that we experience it. We experience it in our mind, we experience it somatically in the body. We have unconscious automatic reactions to certain fear, but really what's going on is that the mind is perceiving a threat of some sort, and it's trying to steer us away from it because it learned from the past that that threat will result in something bad, some kind of bad outcome. And so, really, everything that we're feeling blocked by or stuck by is just an automatic pattern of trying to avoid something from the past that we didn't have the ability to process back then. And some of the common examples that show up inside of the transformative work would be um, the fear of rejection or the fear of abandonment or the fear of getting hurt, the fear of um, shame, embarrassment, etc. And so when the mind is taking it's interpreting this experience that we see is available to us, this change that we want to make, this opportunity that we have to make a different choice, to go in a different direction, to actually change ourselves and change our lives. And it's inherently any new opportunity is going to be a bit unknown. And so the mind is automatically going to fill in the blanks of the unknown and of the uncertainty of that new thing with information that it's stored from the past. And the information that it's most likely going to use from the past is information about how certain things resulted in pain. Certain things resulted in some kind of massive discomfort that at the time we didn't know how to process. And so we've just, instead of learning to process it, learned to avoid it. Really, that's how the mind works. And so when the mind is filling in the blanks around what this is going to mean for us, what could potentially happen, there's, this experience of rejection, abandonment, insecurity, not being okay, being depressed, that's being automatically projected onto this unknown new thing. Even if consciously you can see that it would be a good thing to do, unconsciously, the mind is automatically going to assume worst case scenario as a protective mechanism. And so really what's happening is that our automatic processes internally are trying to steer us away from something that we're perceiving as a threat.
And taking it one step further than that, what we're perceiving as a threat is an experience of us inside of that reality. And the reason why we're perceiving it as a threat is because there's a part of us that already feels that it's true. And if we succumb to a reality where we're forced to realize that it is true, then we can no longer avoid that truth or try to change it. And that's a very
Yes.
threatening experience for the ego.
Can we give
To
an example of that? Because that is brilliant. And I want someone to know exactly what you mean by getting confirmation that an experience of you is true. What could that look like?
let me try to use myself as an example off the top of my head. And I'll just use myself in terms of what I'm going through right now in my life. So I'm building this free community, which was an idea that came to me. It really did come through me, and it's something that deeply inspires me. And if I take the action to create it and it's a complete failure, then I am forced to come to the realization that this idea that I had was no one wanted it. I wasn't worthy of it. I wasn't capable of creating something from it. And what that means about me is that I am less than, I am unworthy of this vision of myself that I want to embody. Nobody cares about what I have to say. What I have to say isn't interesting. I'm not talented. And on and on and on and on and on. And the reason why I might fear creating this community would be if it were to fail and I would be forced to realize those things as true about me, because there's a part of me that already fears that those things are true or could be true, that I don't have anything positive to say, that I'm not actually good at what I do, that nobody cares about what I'm doing or finds what I'm doing interesting or helpful. And so there's a part of me that's already feeling those things or hopes that those things aren't true. And by creating this community, there's a part of me that's trying to prove that those things are not true. But my biggest fear is that the community fails and then have to be faced with the realization that they were in fact true all along and there's nothing I
Mhm.
can do to change it.
Perfect example. And to go like right into it, something that I want to point out to the audience is that there's an illusion behind that line of thinking that says that it would be more painful to have the quote unquote evidence that that's true about me than to hang out in limbo and never know. Like, that is the operating system that a lot of us are operating from, where it's like, if I go for this thing and it doesn't go the way that I want, and then I'm gonna have to sit inside of the experience of having failed, not having been good enough, feeling embarrassed, feeling reject whatever that is,
Right.
feeling uncomfortable in some way, then that would be worse than me just carrying this fear inside of me that it might be true and trying to navigate my life around making sure it never gets proven true. We think that the latter is the more comfortable way of living, but it's so obviously not when you really investigate it.
I think in some ways it is. Otherwise, we wouldn't operate that way. And maybe this could be the
Sure.
beginning of our exploration.
Yeah.
Is
Yeah.
like I have noticed that there's sort of two routes that there's sort of two types of operating systems. There's the operating system of one person, which is it's more painful to try and fail than to never try at all. And then there's another operating system, which is it's more painful to never try than it is to try and fail. And I
Right.
think it depends on what you're really afraid of. And I always fall into the camp of it's more painful to never try than to try and fail, because if I never try, I only have myself to blame.
Yeah,
But if
and
I,
what that means about you too. There are
right,
stories that you've made that mean about you that are more
right.
painful than the stories of you tried and failed.
So ultimately, it's the story of you inside of your unconscious that's dictating the action that you take or don't take, and how you feel inside of who you believe that you are. And that's creating this discomfort that's living inside of our body. It's an energy. And I feel like we feel it always, but we're
Mhm.
not super aware that we're feeling it because it's kind of lingering and simmering really deeply beneath the surface. And every
Okay.
action that we take is trying to move us away from that very, very subtly or cover it up so we
Mhm.
don't have to feel it. And this fear of our own fear is having to feel that physically.
Yeah, yeah. Physically, and I think people's perception, like when they imagine themselves being in an experience where that negative thing that they fear happening happened, is also a mental experience too. Like trying to imagine what state of mind they're going to be in if they fail or if something bad happens. I think a lot of people are going to be able to resonate more with like, that would be a terrible headspace. Like, I don't want to be in that position versus like the physical sensation of it, which, if we really look into it, the mental experience is actually trying to distract us from the physical experience when we get into somatic work and how our mind and our body operate. It's really like our mind becomes really active and we get into patterns of thought around self-criticism and self-deprecation and all of that as a way to stay in the mind and distract ourselves from being inside of the discomfort inside of the body. But I think what most people's fear is when they imagine themselves being in a scenario that they don't want, I think they're more able to relate to the headspace that they really don't want to get into.
Which is really interesting because it's the headspace that's escaping a feel like a physical feeling.
Right, exactly. Exactly. And that's the thing with somatic work is when you get into this work, you realize that the method that we're using to try to escape discomfort is actually more painful than the discomfort in the body. Like somatic work teaches you that the thing that we're all running from is like a sensation in the body that's really like not that bad. But we think it's so bad, like, unconsciously, we have these associations that, like, being in the body is so massively uncomfortable that we have automatic patterns of being in our head trying to fix things and trying to self-criticize as motivation to get us out of this place where we don't have to feel the discomfort in our body anymore, when really, like, if we just felt the discomfort in our body, like, that would be a less uncomfortable experience than the torture we put ourselves through.
This brings up a really interesting conversation. What creates the discomfort? Is it the sensation you're feeling, or is it the thought about the sensation? Because we're always feeling sensations and we're always thinking thoughts, but some sensations don't bother us and some thoughts don't bother us, and some sensations really bother us and some thoughts really bother us.
Yeah.
And this is something that someone said to me the other day, which is that the physical sensation of fear and excitement are the same. I think that
Yes.
every time someone says that, I roll my eyes because, like, I understand what
Yeah.
they're saying, but the experience of fear is very different from the experience of excitement, even if the energy of them is similar.
Mm.
So I would love your wisdom on that.
This is so interesting timing because literally this morning, like 2 hours ago, I was doing yin yoga, and I feel like yin yoga is like the ultimate somatic practice, to be honest, because you get so physically uncomfortable. Well, like, physically uncomfortable to a tolerable degree, but, like, then sitting in it and not moving for so long. For those that don't know, let me just say yin yoga is where you get into a stretch and then you hold it for like 5 minutes, just so that you know. So you get into your body into like a pretty deep stretch and then you stay there and you just breathe for like 5 minutes. And oh my God, my mind just goes haywire. Like batshit crazy when I'm doing yin yoga because it's so resistant to the sensations that I'm feeling in my body. And this morning, I randomly like experienced this process for the first time during yin yoga where I was like, okay, I'm calling this sensation uncomfortable, but what if it was pleasurable? So kind of playing with the same concept that you're saying that excitement is fear. And I actually, like, dipped into it. Like, I watched myself dip into this sensation is pleasurable and actually being in that, like, feeling, like, my glute muscles, like, stretching out and being like, "That feels good." Whereas, like, 5 seconds ago, I was like, "Oh my god, oh my god, oh my god, is it 5 minutes? Oh my god, this is so uncomfortable, I need to get out of it, oh my god." Like, it was so weird to watch myself from that like massive resistance and fear around what I was like just being in my body, like so tense around it, to like being like, ooh, this feels really good. And then I watched myself like wave in between those two, where it was like, no, this is pleasurable. No, 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 oh my God, it's really, really uncomfortable. Is it almost 5 minutes yet? No, this actually feels really good. And like breathing into it was so weird. So, anyways, that was this morning. So I feel like that's kind of relevant to this conversation. And so what I noticed in that process was that when I was in the experience of like wanting to escape the sensation that I was feeling inside of the pose, there was kind of like it was really subtle and I didn't really hear it consciously, but I was able to sense this like unconscious interpretation that something bad was going to happen. Almost like my body was like, if I don't get out of this pose, I'm gonna break something or snap something. And I wasn't telling myself that consciously, but like I could feel the automatic interpretation of like this discomfort means something bad is going to happen. And as soon as I was able to recognize that and then bring myself into, no, like this is doing something like actually good for my body and like I'm safe and like actually being able to tell myself that and believe it because I for whatever reason was able to tell myself that's true. Like I'm not going to hurt myself during yin yoga. Then I was able to dip into that place of pleasure so much more easily. And it was simply from just recognizing that this threat that my mind automatically associated with discomfort was just inaccurate in that moment.
It was a change, right? You were experiencing a change in sensation, a change in the experience of you, and that change was different and therefore threatening in some capacity. And it was just the thought that change is threatening that lended itself to the fear that came up inside of you, inside of that thought, which might be interesting to explore for you personally.
Yeah.
Right? Like, where in my life am I fearing change? Where do I see change as a threat? Which is interesting.
Always.
Which is an interesting,
Always.
right? Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
But I think that, like, if we look at this from, which I would love to explore this, if we look at this from the perspective of the experience of the physical body, there's
Hmm.
something about feeling, like being present with sensations inside of the physical body that I think that we're not used to getting still with and taking our time with and really exploring and allowing. And that lends itself to, where are we feeling so massively uncomfortable inside of who we are? Where are we not allowing our experience of who we are to be okay? Where are we pushing back against the experience of us
Mm.
and the change that is presented to us, the change that we feel internally, that we perceive to be an external threat?
Hmm. Being in the human body is so foreign to most people that are living in a human body. Like, how much of our life has been dedicated to escaping our body and like the
Changing our
actual sensation
body,
of it?
yeah,
Right. Like
making our bodies wrong,
leading into the body image conversation, but also leading into conversations around addiction and escapism,
right?
right? All of this has like so much influence in our lives has taught us that our bodies aren't safe to be present and still with. And the most potent way in my personal life, but I think a lot of people can resonate with this too, that this is relevant, is that I experience life almost exclusively through my thoughts. And I've worked on transitioning out of that over the years, but it's a slow process and a very, very, very intentional one because automatically my whole life is just thoughts responding to what I'm seeing outside of me, and then what I'm seeing outside of me activating more thought. Like it's just thoughts all day long from the minute that my alarm goes off to the minute that I am knocked unconscious at the end of the day. I am just experiencing life through my thoughts. And it's so interesting to recognize how true that is in everyday life, where it's like when I think back on moments of my day, I remember them from what I was thinking, not from like how that made me feel, but like more like what types of thoughts that made me think, more so. Like that person might have made me feel good or excited about something in a conversation that we were having. But when I'm like really nitpicking and looking at how I experienced that moment with them, it was that they changed my thought process to thinking about things that I deem as good. That's really what it was about.
What could be really interesting is to explore if that's really true or if that's your perception.
Well, that is my perception.
Yeah, that's your perception. Okay.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Because like there's feelings I'm sure happening, but
Yeah,
that's not my primary
I
experience.
see. Yeah.
Yeah.
And that also lends itself to explore, well, what comes first, the thought or the sensation, which could be really interesting because you could see it as, well, the thought of what I'm afraid of creates the feeling of fear inside of me. Or you could say the feeling of fear was there and the thought was evoked from it,
Mhm.
depending on your perspective. And I don't know that there's a right or wrong answer,
Mhm.
but I have been anytime I talk to my spirit guides, they present everything through the frame of energy. And everything is energy. Thoughts are energy, feelings are energy, emotions are energy, sensations are energy, and energy is constantly flowing. And our physical body is filled with energy. It is energy, but when we perceive an energy to be a threat, we label it as fear, and then that can evoke specific thoughts that are interpreting that sensation. But then if we get into the pattern of thinking to avoid feeling, then it kind of flips it that the thought evokes the sensation. So I would love your wisdom on what your interpretation of that is.
I agree with you. I think that every feeling that we have is gonna it's gonna be evoked by what is the belief system or the story that we've automatically or the meaning that we've automatically attached to something that's happening. And so there is kind of like a thought in a way that precedes the emotion because there's a meaning that's being attached to what's happening. Like there could be so many different ways of responding to the exact same thing depending on the person. Other people are going to have a different reaction to you, and that's primarily based on the meaning that we automatically attach to what's happening. And so if someone gets stopped at a red light, some people's meaning that is automatically attached to that is that now they're going to be late, and because they're late they're going to get a sly comment from their coworker or their boss that they're going to be behind, they're going to have to stay late, and like this whole meaning gets attached to it. But like the automatic meaning was like, that's making my day worse. Red light makes my day worse. And then that evokes a feeling of feeling frustrated or sad or fearful or whatever. And then that perpetuates more of the story. It's like, oh, why would I be feeling sad or fearful or upset about this? It's because, oh, now because I'm late, my day is going to be worse because this is going to happen and that's going to happen, that's going to happen, that's going to happen, that's going to happen. So it kind of like happens simultaneously,
Yeah.
I think, at the same time, but the feeling is primarily evoked by whatever meaning we're attaching to reality.
What my guides were showing me was an infant, where infants don't have their logical processing fully formed yet, and everything goes based on feeling. It's
Yeah.
just reaction. And then it's over time as our brain kind of develops that it kind of flips where it flips from feeling to thinking. And that's kind of what is encouraged through our education system. And so we kind of get disconnected from the feeling, and the thinking drives everything more so than the feeling. And one is not better or worse than the other. It's just a matter of awareness
Mhm.
of what's really going on for you and learning how to get reconnected back into feeling and witnessing that. Like an infant doesn't necessarily consciously think about what they're feeling as a threat or not. They just know that they're hungry or tired, and they're expressing that. They're expressing
Mhm.
what they're feeling without thinking too much about it. But it's the thinking about all of the could be's and should be's and would be's and what that means about us inside of them that creates the fear of them, that brings up that familiar sensation that we associate with it.
Mhm.
And then that sensation becomes uncomfortable, and then we fear feeling it. And then that whole process
Yeah.
is exacerbated.
So what does this mean for somebody then who recognizes that there's something that they want that in order to get it, they're going to have to face their fears or their discomfort? What does this mean for them?
I mean, ultimately, they have the choice, right? They have the choice to determine for themselves if they want to do that or not. And it's totally valid to say, this is too big. This is too much of a threat. I'm not ready. It's not worth it. And I don't want to take that route. That's totally fine. And I don't think that that's something to be ashamed of. That's just where you are. And then there's the other option, which is being required to move through the discomfort in order to get to whatever's desired on the other side of it. And I think that there is a perceived third avenue, which is figuring out a way around the discomfort.
Mhm.
However, as we've stated before, the discomfort isn't something outside of you. It's being projected from a belief system that already exists inside of you. And so there is no way around, because
Mhm.
ultimately what you're avoiding is a thought about you. And the thought about you
Mhm.
isn't going to go away depending on the action that you take. It's always going to live there unless you question it or
That's right.
allow its existence to be there without buying into the reality of it. And so there is no way around. There's
Mhm.
only avoid or through. And so if the choice is through, it's going to become a matter of learning how to hold the discomfort with a greater capacity so that it doesn't feel as alarming to the nervous system. And I think we've mentioned this in past episodes where we all have a window of tolerance, which is the degree to which you can hold discomfort or face discomfort or be in the experience of discomfort. And the window of tolerance is elastic, meaning that you can increase your capacity to feel uncomfortable without it feeling as alarming over time. And the way to do that is through practice, through a, holding it through a compassionate lens and a safe lens. And what that really means is typically when we're faced with discomfort, we are hard on ourselves and we shame ourselves and we tell ourselves it should be different or we're wrong for this or the experience it needs to move faster or it's not working the way I want it to. And we tell ourselves all these stories about how the experience of the discomfort we're having should be different than it is. And that creates more discomfort. So you're actually being required to hold a greater capacity of discomfort when you do that. And so when you can be a little bit more compassionate with yourself, very gently be allowing of that discomfort and very slowly just tiptoe in over time without diving in head first, which is about the safety component of this. Over time, your window of tolerance increases and your ability to move through it becomes easier where you might have felt more triggered by it previously. And we can talk about what that actually looks like too.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that one aside that I want to give is that when we're when we're approaching it from that familiar narrative of like just got to face the discomfort and push through the fear and all of that, in some ways that kind of strikes me as its own method of avoidance in a weird like counterintuitive way. Because really what that narrative and that very like push through masculine approach to like moving through our resistance and our fears and our blocks is like trying to push to the other side of it, trying to get it over with, kind of in a way, which really never lends itself to allowing our nervous system to adapt and to stretch and to open and to get safe inside of the experience that we are stepping into. It's like, let's just go through it and be in like, fire! You're gonna get to the other end of it and you'll be okay. That's kind of like that whole narrative is really
It's
speaking to that.
it's a subtle form of self-rejection
Yeah.
because what is fear? It's a thought about you. It's
Mm.
a reality that you're trying to avoid being realized. And so when you try to push through your fear, you're trying to push through an aspect of who you fear that you are. And there's a part of you that is telling yourself that your experience that you're having of who you are is wrong and you want to push it away to get to the other side of it, which is going to be a better experience of you. And I think that that completely misses the point
Hmm.
because fear is not a problem. Fear is an experience of you that we make a problem, and that's why we fear it.
Yes. Yes. We make
But
it a
when,
problem through the stories that we tell ourselves about it and the meaning
yeah.
that we attach to it.
And I think that's where the fear of our fear really comes from, is we're telling ourselves that that shouldn't be the experience that we're having. It should be easier, it should be different. And
Hmm.
then it makes it so much harder to hold
That's
than
right.
to tell ourselves, well, why shouldn't this be my experience? Why shouldn't I feel fear? What if it's supposed to be hard? And I would argue that the experience of fear is something to be cherished, because without experiencing fear, you can't transcend it.
Yeah.
And it's the
Yeah.
transcendence of an experience of you that you are buying into that you no longer do, that is ultimately what this is all about. That
Hmm.
that is the whole overcoming part.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you for saying it that way. Because I've been really playing with this concept of like the emotional experience and the emotional range existing on a spectrum for the last few years. And it really began for me. I think I might have mentioned this in a recent episode where I had this insight that happiness was not the absence of sadness. Happiness was the embracing and the acceptance of all of it, which really created this model in my head that, like, the more that we expand into these higher vibrational emotions and experiences of like happiness, joy, bliss, love, peace, like all of that, that doesn't come from getting rid of the other feelings. It comes from opening up to them. Like we need to open up on, here we go, Zoom, on one end of the spectrum, um, in order to access the other end of the spectrum. And so when it comes to fear, if we think that in order to feel okay about ourselves or to feel at peace or to feel happy with ourselves, feel happy with our lives, that we need to overcome this fear, we're going about it wrong. Because it's when we open up to and fully embrace the experience of fear and allow it to be a part of our human experience. Like you said, like it should be this way. It should feel this hard. It's supposed to feel this hard when we can really melt into those experiences of fear or grief or shame or sadness, with that being the backbone of like just full faith that it's supposed to be there, then we are inherently opening ourselves up to the other end of the spectrum too, of higher levels, higher access to love, joy, peace, excitement, bliss, all of that.
Which is an embracing of all that you are. That's what that is. Like
That's right.
bliss is not the absence of fear, it's finding the acceptance and allowance of it.
That's
And I
right.
would argue that pushing through and overcoming fear, you could argue, is the same thing as avoiding it.
And I'm glad that our conversation took that turn because I never looked at it that way.
Yeah.
But then really like getting in tune with that narrative of like just push through. You got to face the discomfort and be in it. And like you're never going to get anything in your life if you're not uncomfortable and facing all your fears. Like although there's aspects of wisdom and truth inside of that, it does feel like it's coming from that essence of avoidance, like trying to overcome it to get to the other side of it where it no longer exists anymore.
And looking at just life from a very, very high level, I think that this has been the evolution of man,
Yeah.
right? Where we're moving from a space where fear is something to be avoided to then to a space of fear is something to be overcome to now a space of fear is not a problem. And it's through navigating these different experiences of who we are through the timeline of humanity that we're evolving and essentially ascending that's what that is. It's a greater allowance of every experience of who we are rather than only an allowance of certain ones. And I think that's a beautiful thing.
Mhm.
Fear lends itself to an experience that you desired to have when you came here. And fear exists in every level of dimensional reality. It's just that we interpret it differently here. And I think that that's the only difference is we interpret it as a threat and therefore tense and close our physical bodies to it and then feel excess discomfort inside of us physically, mentally, and emotionally that we then compound on top of it with our thoughts about what that means about us.
Yeah, an endless cycle.
And ultimately, we're moving from this place of masculinity to this place of femininity, of opening, of allowing, of creating a safe and loving, like womb for this part of us to feel afraid and to be nurtured rather than rejected.
Mm, I love that. I I feel very complete with this. But is there anything else around this idea that you think you would like to wrap up in a bow?
Yeah, I would like to come back to how I came upon this idea for this conversation in the first place,
Yeah.
where I created this community feeling like there was nothing that I saw out there that was a where you could be met with the reflection of you. Every other experience I've ever seen was designed to change your experience of you, not to experience you inside of it, without any regard for what you want to do with it other than simply to have the experience. And this feels a little counterintuitive because we're taught what's the point of having experience unless we want to change something? Because changing who I am will lend itself to more comfort where I'm already feeling discomfort living inside of me. But it's through the allowance of your current experience of you that discomfort dissipates. And so I would like to offer something to anybody that resonates with this idea of I'm no longer searching to escape the discomfort that I'm feeling, but I'm looking to offer it a safe space to exist so that I can transcend it. And in doing so, transcend this version of me and feel a more open, accepting, and loving version of me, which is that it's going to require baby steps. It's going to take time. It's going to feel threatening and uncomfortable, and you're going to be resistant to it, and you're not going to want to do it, and you're probably going to avoid it for a while. And there's going to be this whole cycle that you're going to find yourself in where you may be presented with an opportunity to have exactly what you want and find yourself not wanting to take a step forward into it. And that's just reflecting back to you that there's fear inside of what you're telling yourself you want to, that this fear is acting as a protective mechanism in a way, which is something that we don't think we realize is that we see fear as the problem and standing in the way of what we want. But fear is actually protecting you from something else
Mhm.
that you perceive as more fearful, but more, more threatening on the other side of it. So there's all of these different layers that require time to sit with, and ultimately allowing that process to be okay is going to be the doorway through it,
Mhm.
rather than feeling like the process in and of itself should be different than it is.
That's the ultimate lesson in life. Like literally apply that to everything and you will be just fine.
Yeah, you always are just fine, but it's your perception that you're not that creates your suffering.
That's right. Yeah. Anytime that we are at war with reality, we suffer.
Well, this was a really interesting exploration that took a lot of unique twists and turns. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in, and we'll see you next week.